Hi guys, thanks for watching. Today I want to talk about the router sled using the Rexroth system. It's certainly not my design, however if like me you're a little bit limited for space, I've only got this one table really that I'm working off, then the changes I've made to the permanently positioned router sled may be of help to you. I'll also go through the various mistakes that I've made with ordering unnecessary parts, not ordering some of the required parts, and the actual router fixing to the sled itself, which probably caused me the most amount of head scratching, but there's little information about when I was doing the initial investigation. We'll have a look at the router bits and why it's important to pay a little bit extra for a better finish. I'll put the part numbers up on the screen as we go along. The company that I bought from in England is a company called KJN. Very good company. I'm not affiliated in any way. I tried a few companies, but I found their website to be really good. Very good at explaining the parts with pictures, which for me was ideal. So let's get started. I'm using a standard 8x4 sheet, 3/4 inch MDF, 2440 by 1220. I then got the 80x40 section Rexroth Profile cut exactly 2440, so it fits very well on the edge of the MDF sheet, using T-bolts and flange nuts. The bolts are inserted through holes, and then the profile just sits on top. In order to get your holes accurate, I used a set square, put the pencil in the 20mm hole, dragged it all the way along the edge of the table, got myself a parallel line, and then just drilled the holes accordingly. I drilled 5 holes. In fact I could have got away with 3, one at each end and one in the middle. Then in go the T-bolts. They twist into position from the underside, which is very helpful, so you haven't got to approach it from underneath. And then with the flange nuts, they secure the profile in place. We can see here, once the profile has been put on top of the T-bolt, you just lift slightly, twist it through 90 degrees, and then the flange nuts will then secure it. Here you can see the 80x40 sections are on their side, because the thickness of the wood that I'm planning on flattening is only 43mm, so I don't need the router sled to be that high. If however you have thicker pieces of wood, then you can turn them upright and fix them in exactly the same way to the T-bolts and the flange nuts, which gives you a better clearance on your router sled. I'll come back in a moment to why I'm pulling the 80x40 sections over the edge of the table, but for the moment I just want to talk about the two component parts which go between the 80x40 section and the router sled itself. The router sled is 400 wide. I cut these at 500 just to give me a bit of clearance. I thought it might be useful, in fact it wasn't. I thought I might need to be able to put some kind of locking system onto that axis, but I don't. So 400 in fact would be fine. And then between the 40x40 and the 80x40 profiles, you've got 2 nylon sliders, which I in fact ordered incorrectly. I thought they would work. They don't. They're a bit flimsy and they get clogged up very easily once you start planing the wood down. On top of these two 40x40 profiles fits the sled itself, which the width of which is 1220, the same size as the MDF. So onto the sled itself. It's all made up of 40x40 profile, on top of which the SBR20 guide rail is fixed, and then you can see the plate itself is then fixed onto the guide rail. The plate itself was a little bit more challenging, so in the end what I did was make up the rectangular frame with a 40x40 box section, and the SBR20 linear guide rails and the carrier blocks I took down to local metalworkers and told them to make me a plate from a picture very similar to this one. With regards to the fabrication of the rectangular section itself, just a couple of points to consider. Make sure you use the 20mm T-bolts to connect the triangular corners. Initially I didn't, and it became very tricky trying to get those flange nuts on in such a close space. Here you can see the 20mm, before it was 25, or maybe I even used 30, yeah, was a pain. The next point to consider is with reference to the core screws. Bosch make two profiles, the BR and the IR range. This is the BR range, which comes with the facility for the centres to be self-tapped with a 10mm core screw. I've tried it, it works, it's time consuming and it's not ideal. So for the sake of a couple of bucks, you can add to your order the request that both ends are tapped. And if you're feeling a little bit extravagant, you can also add to your order and ask them to drill these holes at each end. So just going back to the sliders, these are the ones I bought, these are the ones that you want. I mentioned earlier that I had the centre 40x40 section cut at 500mm as opposed to 400. This was to allow a locking facility on the left that you can see there, which really wasn't necessary. And so the two profiles are connected together using 55mm T-bolts and flange nuts. After putting the system together a couple of times, it really only takes between 4 and 5 minutes. Essentially, you have 5 component parts. The two 80x40 sections which you connect through the holes. You have the spacers on the sliders and then the router sled itself. The fixing of the router to the plate itself was the next point that required a bit of thought. This is the Makita, the RP2301. I called Makita and asked them if they made a quick release surface mounted plate because the router looked like it lent itself to the application, but in fact they don't. Apparently Festool make a surface mounted quick release plate, but I didn't want to go to the extra expense of buying a Festool router. So when I took the sled frame down to the metal workers to get the plate made, I took the router base plate with me and asked them to drill the holes just so they would marry up with the router itself. The other point to mention is the length of the M4 screws that fix the router plate to the base of the router. I think only 10mm long. Obviously you need to go through the sled plate as well, so I bought off Amazon M4 machine screws, I think 20mm, and then that gives you enough length to go through the sled plate into the base of the router. Make sure you tighten the screws evenly. I had an instance when I first started using this system where the two left side screws weren't tightened adequately. I was trying to tighten them from the underside without pulling the 80x40 sections over the edge of the table, and the router itself lifted slightly and I couldn't understand why I wasn't getting an even planing. So once that's done, you're good to go. You can push the 80x40 sections over the table. They can be tightened with the flange nuts, and then it's just a question of lining up the sled on the 80x40 sections, and then you can start your planing. So moving on to the router bits themselves, this is the bit that I bought when I first had the system operational. It's 12 or 15 bucks off Amazon, and it lasted about 10 minutes. It became blunt very quickly and left pretty nasty linear marks across this face of, this piece of wood is olive ash pearl. Rotational marks where it got stuck because the blades simply weren't sufficient to hold their sharpness. You can sand them out, but you'll probably need a 60 or 80 grit paper to start off with, and it's time consuming. So this is the bit that I bought afterwards. It's a CMT 12mm for the Makita router. It's got 3 cutting edges with 4-sided carbide inserts which you can rotate once they lose their sharpness. Very nice router bit. About 110 bucks, but well worth the money. The next thing to talk about is the extraction. Obviously I'm outside here, so any dust that's generated from the plating itself can just get swept away. But what does happen is the channels where the sliders sit get clogged up. There's about a 3mm gap between the base of the slider and the bottom of the channel, and that becomes filled with the sawdust. Obviously depends on how much you're shaving off at a time. I never go more than 1.5 millimeters, but you do find yourself having to get the air gun out and just clean the channels on a quite regular basis. I did think about having the SBR 20s on the X and Y section. Here it's just on the Y section, but that would then limit yourself to be able to turn the 80 by 40 profiles over to give you your higher clearance for larger pieces of wood. Thanks for watching, guys. If you need any help on any of the part numbers that I've displayed above, then drop me a line in the comments section below. I'm pretty good at getting back to people. Or in fact, if you've got any ideas about how this system that I've got can be improved, then I'm always open to suggestions. So for now, that's all from Andalusia, and I'll see you next time.